So our paperwork didn't quite get put out the way we wanted to. Anyway, on that second page, or the back side of the first page, you'll notice that there are retroactive subparts and non-retroactive subparts. And what retroactive subparts mean, if a regulation goes into effect and it's inside one of those subparts, then it's in effect for everything that has already been previously installed. Okay? The non-retroactive subparts only applies to stuff that you're going to put in the ground today. So when something goes into effect, it applies then, but it doesn't apply anything prior that was already put in the ground. Okay? And that's how the code's pretty much set up. On the next page, this is just to tell us about the seminar. Okay? If the building was okay, if you liked the presentations, all that fun stuff. Of course, on the back side of that is my name. You can say Bryan did a horrible job, or he talks too fast, which is typical. Believe it or not, I was born in Alabama, and people in Alabama apparently don't speak very fast, but I have a tendency to. So if I do speak too fast, you can tell me. Any other additional notes, you want some coffee or something like that during the seminar, put that down here too, okay? But other than that, this will help you out, kind of get you started. This presentation will also go into some of that. We're supposed to do a regulatory update, but to be perfectly honest, there haven't been a whole bunch of them. There haven't been a whole bunch of updates. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how the code is structured, kind of get some of you familiar with this. And we are going to talk about some of the updates, and some of them we'll talk about this afternoon, okay? This is one of my favorite slides, warning mass confusion, because that's exactly the way the code is. If you look at those retroactive versus non-retroactive subparts and how they're laid out, it's kind of confusing how the code's written. And then sometimes you'll find things that are in multiple places. That's because it's written into a new subpart or a non-retroactive subpart, but it has to be tied into a retroactive subpart at the same time. So you'll see stuff duplicated sometimes, and you're going, why is it here and here? And that's the reason why. So looking at the history of the code, we originally wrote the code off of ASME B31.8. We had Title 49 come into effect in the 1970s, okay, of 70 through 79. And during that time, all the different parts that we are familiar with, Part 192, Part 199, all those came into effect during those years. Now, whenever an investigator comes to your site, they're looking at several layers of regulation, okay? Dave and I only deal with the federal regulations, which is this middle part here. But there are also state promulgated rules, and most of y'all are familiar with those. Those are additional rules that the state puts on you that you also have to meet, okay? They have to be more stringent than Part 192, but those are in addition to. And then when you start going out further, your own O&M manual, say you have the federal rules and you have the state regs, and you say, well, I want to do this, I'm not happy with this, I want to go a little bit farther, I want to go one step further. So in your O&M manual, you write it in that you're going to do some additional things, or you're going to do some additional stuff to ensure that your system's operating properly. When an inspector looks at your program, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at your O&M manual, okay? And your O&M manual becomes law at the point that you write it into it. So if you say, okay, I'm going to do leak survey every year instead of every 5 years, that becomes law, okay? And at that point, I can write you a violation if you go 2 years, even though Part 192 only says 5, okay? So it's important to understand that. Just remember that Parts 192, for example, 192, they're minimum federal safety standards. Looking at U.S. code, a lot of people don't look at U.S. code, but there's a lot of stuff in U.S. code that's not in the 190 series, okay? So we have some additional definitions. We have the rights, not just the rights of the inspectors, but your rights as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Special permits or waivers. So if you have something in your system that just can't meet regulations, or it's over the top, something you can't perform, you can actually request a waiver. And if PHMSA approves it, then you can continue on, and usually they put little stipulations on it. For example, I want to put in a type of pipe that isn't covered underneath the design in Part 192. If I'm going to do that, then I have to write the DC with a waiver, with a request for a waiver, explain the reason for doing it, the engineering analysis saying that the pipe is good to be put in the ground. And people like myself and Max Kiva and them will all sit down, decide if that's if it's a viable solution to whatever your problem is, and approve it. And then we may have some additional things like you have to dig it up every couple of years to verify that the pipe is still in good condition, or you may have to cut pieces out of it. Okay? So that's the waiver process. It also gives authority to us as inspectors, or authority as for the state programs, for the state program folks. All that authority is also written in 601. Jurisdiction, enforcement. Believe it or not, our jurisdiction, PHMSA's jurisdiction, is from the burner tip all the way to the wellhead. Okay? But we only choose to inspect a small portion of that. You think about building code as actually handling everything inside your house, so we don't really concern ourselves with the inside of structures. Gathering, there are so many different things that are happening out in gathering, we don't actually look at all of it. Okay? It's almost impossible, and we don't have enough inspectors to do it. There are less than 200 federal inspectors. So if you think about the hundreds of thousands of miles of pipe out there in the ground, it's really hard for us to keep up with all of it. Our enforcement practices, all of that's also in there. Okay? Everything, as far as enforcement's concerned, can be disputed by you. Okay? Everything. So if I write you a violation for something, then you could come to the commission, or you could go to the regional office or something like that, and you could rebuke it. Okay? You have that right as an operator. 601.17c, and you'll see this also in 203. Entry and inspection. This allows the operator to come into your facility and take a look at it. Okay? They have to display proper credentials if you ask for. Most of you all know your inspectors, so it's not that big of a deal, right? But if you don't know who they are, they have to provide their credentials, and they have the right to enter the premises. Now, the deal is, I can enter the premises, but under federal law, I have to give you some type of reasonable accommodation. I have to call you up ahead of time and say, hey, Bill, I'm showing up next week. Can you have a guy out there available to us? We can't just show up randomly unless something actually happens. So if there's an explosion or somebody gets injured or something like that, then we can show up on site and we can just walk right onto the site. Otherwise, by federal law, we have to give you some type of notice, some type of notification. The only time that doesn't apply is when you're working on a right-of-way. If you're doing construction on a right-of-way, we can drive up and we can inspect anything that's being performed on that right-of-way because it's public access. Okay? So reasonable time and reasonable manner. I can't show up at your facility at 6 o'clock in the morning knocking on your door expecting you to do something for me. Can't do it. So this is just mirrored in 190, and it kind of breaks it down into a little bit more. Upon inspect, examine, reasonable time and a reasonable manner. Okay? Records of properties, persons. Now here's the deal. We have documentation that falls out over a period of time. Okay? We have documentation that falls out if we have a documentation retention interval of 5 years, but you decide to keep it for 10 years. We still have the right to access that as long as you can access it. Okay? So even though that has fallen outside the retention interval, we still have access to it. So if we come in and we ask for it, we know you have it, you have to provide it to us. You can't say, well, that's outside the documentation interval. It doesn't work. I don't know why it's doing that. Typically, when we're looking at inspections, we're looking at routine scheduling. We try to schedule, I was a state inspector for 5 years. We try to schedule things ahead of time, usually a year in advance. Now, I realize that we have people that have kids in softball and sports and things like that, not able to make the inspections. So we just try to reschedule that with you, but we try to give you as much leeway as possible. If we have a complaint from a member of the public, we can show up on your site. So a person in the public says, well, I saw gas blowing at that facility or something like that, then we could show up. Any type of report from a state agency, pipeline accident or incident, of course, we can walk on your facility. And the only person that can kick us off the facility if you have an accident is the fire marshal. The fire marshal's God on an incident site. And we've had inspectors handcuffed and stuck in the back of cars before because they argued with them. So we try to tell our inspectors and say, guys, don't mess with the fire marshal. He's God out there. But if anything happens, pipeline accident, incident, we have to show up. And then, of course, anytime we feel that it's appropriate for us to show up. For example, if we typically don't write violations on everything we find when we go out and do an inspection. Well, we'll typically have notations and things like that. We may do a follow-up, just show up at your facility, see if you're doing what you said you were going to do. Okay. Pipeline codes, this kind of breaks them down a little bit. 190 is the safety programs. This is state programs, investigator rights, your rights as operators. 191, transportation of natural and other gas pipeline, and this is your reports. So your yearly reports, your leaks, things like that. Of course, 192 is natural gas. Anything to do with natural gas is in that section, also propane. LNG is 193. 195 is liquids, and then, of course, 199 is your drug and alcohol programs. Okay? Most of y'all are probably only going to be interested in 190, 191, 192, and 199 for this session. Whenever we're looking at the code, we're also looking at different things that are being pulled into the code. How many propane operators do we have? 1, 2, 3. That's it. NFPA 58 and 59, right? Part of they're incorporated by reference into the gas code. They're the oddballs. Okay? NFPA 58 and 59 supersede the code. So when you look at 192, anything that's in NFPA 58 and 59 overrules it. Okay? However, for API, ASME, ASTM, all those other documents, 192 supersedes them. So if there's a conflict in those documents, then 192 prevails. However, it's the opposite for NFPA 58 and 59. Okay? And we incorporate these documents. Usually we'll incorporate the entire document. Sometimes we incorporate sections of those documents. We say Section 4, well, only Section 4 will apply. If you need to go and look at one of these documents, you can go online. They are supposed to be available for you for free. You won't be able to print them or anything like that. We should be able to look at them on the setting site. So if you go to the setting site for NFPA 58, then you should be able to see that document. To kind of give you how complex this gets, 192 is 152 pages. Okay? If you took just the ASTM D2513-09A, which is your plastic pipe standard, if you just took that one document and all the additional standards that are referenced within it, it's over 1,000 pages by itself. And we address incorporate 3 different documents there. Okay? So this gets really, really deep really quickly. If you're looking at those of you that have plastic PPI TR33, PPI TR33 is the butt fusion standard. It's your generic procedures for butt fusion. Okay? ASTM 638, I think it's up there somewhere. Yeah, 638, that's your strap testing. Okay? There's also some mil specs. PPI TR41 is for saddles. All those are incorporated inside of this document. Okay? So you got to keep in mind that whenever we're referencing one document, we're typically referencing a whole bunch of additional ones to go along with it. Unfortunately, you're wondering why a lot of times regulations take a long time to come out. Guys like me are beavering away inside of these standards trying to make sure that all of them meet the regulations that we've already written. So whenever we go and we look, for example, we just updated the plastic pipe stuff I know we'll talk about this afternoon. We went to ASTM D2513-12AE1, but we also had to go back through all these additional standards to ensure that they did not countermine what was in Part 192. So it just takes a long time to do. Whenever standards go into effect, for example, we had a plastic pipe change. And by the way, I'm the plastic pipe guy. That's the reason why it's plastic up here. If you go as far as the people that wrote the regulation, as far as the new plastic pipe regulation, and that are on the plastic pipe team, I'm one of the 3 in PHMSA. If an operator installs a PE pipe in their system throughout 2015, what version of ASTM D2513 has to be used? Well, it depends on it, what time it was purchased. So March 6, 2015, we had a reg change at that point in time. It went into effect, okay? Everything prior to that in 192 specifically said 2406 or 3408 material, okay? And you would do your design in 192, 121 based on these two numbers, okay? Now, if I purchase pipe prior to that, I can continue to use it, but after that date, if I purchased 2406 or 3408, I would not be able to use it anymore because it fell out of the design criteria at that time, okay? So if I purchased it before it, I can continue to use it. If I purchased it afterwards, I would not be able to use it because it was no longer inside the standard. Does that make sense? And sometimes we give you a little leeway. So if we know there's some problems, for example, the new plastic pipe wall, we've allowed some additional time to adapt to changes. We're not against that. We're not trying to hurt your harmony in any way. We're just trying to bring this stuff up to date. And to be honest with you, Congress is on our back about this, about keeping standards and stuff up to date. So we're just doing the best we can, okay, just like everybody else. Other documents, there are a lot of PHMSA interpretations out there. And what happens in interpretation is you have a regulation, and you're not really sure how it applies to you. You can request from D.C. An interpretation, and that interpretation basically takes your specific facility, your specific circumstances into account, and applies a regulation to it. So it tells you how the regulation applies. So people like us, Dave and everybody else inside of PHMSA, sit down and we look at them, and we'll edit it and send a response back to you. But those are out there. They're publicly available. You can go and you could look them up. If you want to look to a specific code section, for example, 192105 is the design criteria for steel. If I wanted to find out the interpretations for that, I can look at 105, and I can reference all the interpretations from that. There's like 30 of them, okay? And I can go through them one by one, see how they've been applied to different operators. We have alert bulletins. These are typically special. We'll have certain types of materials. You're pretty close. We had Driscoll Plex 8000 issues here in Nevada and parts of California down into Arizona, where we were having problems with that particular type of pipe. The team got together and we created an advisory bulletin based on that and provided it to the public. It's not something you have to address, but it's to give you a forewarning that we've seen problems, systemic problems with certain types of materials or products or stuff like that. So you kind of have a forewarning that something's happening. We also do them for like hurricanes and things like that. So Superstorm Sandy, we did 5 for that one. For integrity management, for those of you that have transmission, I just did 5 of those last year for transmission. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Enforcement documents, sometimes we'll provide those, depending on, DC's kind of playing on copywriting those now, but there are some enforcement documentation out there. You can kind of see how we're going to apply the regulations and how they work with the inspection documentation. We also have a memorandum of understanding with certain groups. It's not really going to apply to you. There are 23 non-OSHA states in the United States. We have 2 regulations that kind of meet OSHA's requirements. Technically, by OSHA standards, we would not be able to operate our systems because with flammable materials, the amount of concentration there, we just wouldn't be able to operate. So they've kind of backed off a little bit and allowed us to do that. 192721 for accidental ignition and fire extinguishers, and then 192605 for protection against hazards. Those are written into the regulations. So that's kind of an understanding between us and OSHA. We also have some additional things with FERC and the EPA and stuff like that. Associate standards, NACE, those of you who want to be qualified for corrosion or you want to run a corrosion program in distribution integrity management, you may want to get NACE certified. ASTM, we do a lot with ASTM, API, ASME, NFPA. The gentleman right next to me is an NFPA wizard. He's been doing it for 40 years. So he's a really interesting guy. But most of the PHMSA folks are all involved in these, and they, if you have a concern or something like that, bring it up to us, and we'll bring it up in the meetings. When we go to address these standards and we go to update them, we'll try our best to take care of those. So this is Wayne. Wayne's actually in at the fire marshal. Where's the fire marshal at? Long Beach. He's at the other side. He's doing the fire marshal. This is our HAZWOPER training. I've been training HAZWOPER with Wayne for 10, 15 years. Types of rules, legislative, these are the ones that Congress basically says, thou shalt do something. Aliso Canyon, for example, the underground storage stuff, they said, hey, you will do something. And we didn't even have time to write a regulation. They just said, you will do it, and you will do it now. And that's prime directive. Non-legislative, often referred as guidance type rules, and then, of course, interpretive rules tell the public what the agency thinks the statute, the rules of the agency should be. The rulemaking process, sometimes this is started by operators, sometimes it's started by PHMSA, and sometimes it's started by Congress. But basically all of us sit down inside of a room. We try to take into account every single environment that we may be in. And that's one of the reasons why we put it out. We actually put it out as a notice of proposed rulemaking. And at that point, you as operators have the opportunity, you have 60 days to address it. So you actually have 60 days to make comments on it, and then we have to address each one of those comments. A good example of that is one that really kind of struck me kind of weird, the ability to lay plastic on top of the ground temporarily up to 2 years. I thought it was just really strange. I could see you using a temporary bypass or something like that, but not on top of the ground for 2 years. Come to find out, in Alaska, whenever they go to install services during the wintertime, it takes 8 hours to dig 6 inches. Okay? 8 hours. Propane, it looks kind of like a square rack, and they put it on the ground, and it takes them 8 hours to dig 6 inches. So it's not feasible for them to run services underground during the wintertime. So what they do is they lay the services on top of the ground, and when the summertime comes around, they dig down and they bury the service line. So things like that we have to take into consideration whenever we're writing these. Now, we have had some to go through notice of proposed rulemaking twice, but usually it just goes through once. We address all the public comments, and we typically have a public hearing where the public can address it and they can watch it. They're taped, so if you want to watch those online, and then the final rule will come out after that. NPRMs or our final rules are all posted in the Federal Register. You can go out and you can pull those up. They're also posted on the PHMSA website. You can go and look them up there. However, the new PHMSA website, I'm going to tell you, it's not very good. It's really hard to find what you're looking for. You're better off going to the Federal Register and searching it up. There are no sort functions or search functions unless they've updated it. Yeah. Yeah, Googling it. Yeah. The employees don't even use the PHMSA website. So we did talk a little bit about retroactive subparts. Just kind of explains it in case you didn't get any notation on it. You will get a copy of these slides, so you don't have to worry about that. This is the way we have our students remember the retroactive subparts. Kilamop, K-I-L-A-M-O-P. So if you look at each one of those subparts, K, for example, is uprating, I is corrosion, M is maintenance, P is DIMP. So each one of those subparts, those are the retroactive subparts. Non-retroactive subparts, this just kind of explains those out. Usually, typically design materials, things like that. One of the things that's going on right now, too, is the VIS work group. This was a congressional project where they wanted us to get with industry. So the inspectors, industry, standard-setting organizations all get together and discuss issues that we have out there and ways to proceed forward. The problem is there are so many technologies coming out that we have a hard time addressing them in the code, okay? We have a hard time addressing them in the code, and the inspectors have a hard time with them whenever they get on site. Trying to determine, one, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and two, is the technology sufficient in order to do that? So the VIS working group was started, and some of the recommendations and stuff are all supposed to come out here pretty soon. My boss, who is the director, he's one of the ones involved in this, but they have all types of different recommendations: need for identification system, maintain proprietary security sensitive information. One of the big things here the other day was cybersecurity. We're actually going to have to come up with a cybersecurity class or address it in some of our other classes. I don't know if, have any of y'all messed with SCADA? You can hack into a 900 megahertz radio with a Pringles can. So I could actually turn your valves on and off, turn your gas flow on and off, things like that. So cybersecurity is an issue. Exchange of pipeline information, exchanging fact-finding, stuff like that. All that's part of the VIS working group. Best practices. And then, of course, legal barriers and funding. Most of that's on the federal side, though. Some of the additional things we're working on, obviously we have the underground storage regulation that was required by Congress. We had to meet the congressional mandate. That is out and is in the process. They've been inspecting for about a year now. The plastic pipe rule that went into effect January 22nd. I'll be talking about that this afternoon. This one here, me and 4 other guys sat down in office 6 years ago to write this. And it's now finally coming into effect. And it really helps you guys out because you can run some higher pressures, you can run some different materials, you can run the pipe in some applications you couldn't before. So it just allows you some additional things. It's not really a bad regulation at all. Transmission lines, those of you who have transmission, we have 5 rulemakings in process. So I'm not sure, it was originally 1, it was called the mega rule. They're breaking it down now into either 4 or 5 parts. I haven't seen it since it was the mega rule. Gathering line rulemakings also go into that, so any of you have gathering lines may want to keep an eye out for that. Our SCADA team is coming up with some training requirements that are supposed to go into effect. Those are for group training. So the problem is each individual terminal in the SCADA system is personalized, and the individual is trained for each one individual terminal, but they're typically not trained in groups. So we've seen some accidents and incidents where they weren't cooperating with one another, so this addresses that. Not really a big deal. We talked a little bit about OQ. Of course, we had the OQ law come out, OQ regulation come out, but it didn't have any OQ in it. So I don't know when they're going to fix that, or if they're going to fix that, or what. So I know I went through that fairly quick, but there's not a whole lot of updates out there. Any questions on any of that? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Polyethylene, and then we also included polyamide. We had polyamide in the regulation before, PA11, but it was really expensive. A piece of polyamide 11 is almost the price of steel. But we have a new version, it's polyamide 12, and it no longer uses castor beans. It's nylon, but it's synthetic, and it's a lot cheaper. Also, it's a lot less prone to damage. So if you're in an area where you may get a lot of third-party damages and things like that, you may want to consider something like that. It's a pretty good product. So a little bit different than PE. So, but we'll talk about that this afternoon. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to turn it back over to the boss man here.